A former Parkersburg South High School teacher is facing up to 10 years in prison after pleading guilty to charges of sexual abuse. Our Chase Campbell has the details.
Dwain Sponseller entered an Alford plea to 2 counts of sexual abuse in the first degree on Monday, the day his trial was set to begin in the Wood County Circuit Court, according to the clerk of Judge J.D. Bean. Under an Alford plea, the defendant enters a guilty plea while denying their guilt, but acknowledges that there is enough evidence that going to trial would likely result in a conviction. Wood County Assistant Prosecutor Russ Skogstad said he was glad to come to a plea that was agreeable to the victims.
The victims were all consulted or on board, and the investigating officer was, so I don't have to put people through the uncertainty of a trial.
Skogstad said any gratification that might be taken from the guilty plea is tempered by the fact that the legal outcome does little to reduce the harm the victims suffered.
What I've learned in the 20-some years of doing this is there's very little that I can do or that the state can do that can ever make up for what has happened to a child.
Skogstad declined to comment on the specifics of the case as Sponseller is still awaiting sentencing, but said that the state would seek the maximum sentence. Sponseller faces 1 to 5 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000 for each of the felony counts. He will also be placed on the West Virginia Sex Offender Registry for life and could be put under supervised release for up to 50 years after being released from prison. Sponseller was indicted on a total of 16 counts in September of 2024, including 7 other counts of sexual abuse in the first degree and 7 counts of sexual abuse by a parent, guardian, or custodian. Sponseller's sentencing is scheduled for July 24th at 9 a.m. In Parkersburg, Chase Campbell, WTAP News.
Sponseller was suspended without pay from his position at Parkersburg South High School shortly after he was charged in 2024. According to Wood County Schools Superintendent Christy Willis, the Wood County Board of Education voted to formally approve his termination during its meeting tonight.